Class 4, we are on to Chapter 5, Stig at the Dump, which is the Snargets. This looks like it's going to be an interesting one. Let's see what happens. "Why don't you go out and get some fresh air, Barney dear?" asked Grandmother. Barney stood and looked out of the window. "Doesn't look very fresh to me," he grunted. A yellow fog hung over the trees outside. The smoke from the back kitchen chimney stirred into itself, and there seemed to be a smell of distant cement works. "Never mind, dear. It's better than stuffing indoors all day." "All right, Granny, I'll go out." After about 20 minutes, he had found his jersey mixed up with his bedclothes, one outdoor shoe under the bed and the other one under the chest in the hall. He wandered out into the garden. It was neither warm nor cold, and there was no wind at all. He made for the chalk pit, whistling and with his hands in his pockets. As he came near the edge of the pit, he stopped whistling and stood still. There were voices coming from the bottom of the pit. His pit. Well, perhaps it wasn't his pit. It didn't even belong to Grandfather, or did it? Perhaps holes in the ground didn't belong to anybody. All the same, he was quite annoyed that other people should be poking around in his pit. He went curiously to the edge and peeped down. Down there, among the tin cans and other rubbish, were 3 boys of about his age or older, dressed in jerseys and trousers that were grubbier and more tattered than his own, and grey tennis shoes with holes in the toes. They all had long, rather greasy hair. Barney recognised them. They were the Snarget boys, part of a large family who lived in an old house with tarred weatherboards and were always getting into trouble. At least that's what the grown-ups said. But then, who didn't get into trouble? The Snargets seemed to be building some sort of shack for themselves out of dead branches and old sheets of corrugated iron, with a lot of horseplay and cries of, "No, not that way, Clever, like this, see?" Barney crawled into a place where a twisted tree trunk grew up from the very edge of the cliff. He hid himself behind it, broke off a handy-sized clod of clay and roots from the cliff edge, and hurled it at the roof of the shack. It curved through the air towards the target, but missed, and landed almost noiselessly on a mossy log. Barney chose himself another clod and threw it. This time it struck the bottom of an upturned pail and exploded like a little bomb, scattering bits of clay over one of the Snargets. "Here, who's chucking dirt?" cried the first Snarget suspiciously. "I never," said another Snarget. "Must have been him," he added, pointing to the third and the youngest. "Leave off, will you?" said the first Snarget, "or I'll do, you see." "I never done nothing," protested the youngest Snarget. "Oh, you didn't, did you?" said the first. "No, I never." "Well, don't do it again, that's all." At the top of the cliff, Barney, the cause of the trouble, chuckled to himself and broke off another clod. This time his aim was true, and the clod landed fair and square on the sheet of iron with a most satisfying clang. 3 Snarget heads popped out at once like ferrets out of rabbit holes. "I told you someone was chucking dirt," said the first Snarget. "And I told you it weren't me," said the youngest. They looked round, scowling at the floor of the pit. "All right, it's no use in hiding. We can see you," called the eldest Snarget. Barney hugged himself in silence behind his tree trunk. He knew this was just bluff. They hadn't even looked in his direction. "It's old Albert, I bet," said the middle-sized Snarget. "He's been and followed us." "We can see you, Albert," called the first Snarget. "Come out of that bush or we'll come and do you." They were standing looking at the far end of the pit with their backs to Barney. With great care, Barney broke off as big as a clod as he could find and aimed it at the roof of the shack. It hit and exploded with another loud clang, scattering pieces all over the 3 Snargets, who ducked wildly and clutched at each other, and then looked foolish at being taken by surprise. They whispered fiercely amongst themselves, pointing at places on the cliff edge. "Come from behind us, it did." "No, up there. It's up there." "Don't be daft. He's up in them bushes. I tell you, I saw him." They all pointed in different directions at the edge of the cliff. "It's all right, Albert," called the eldest Snarget again. "It's no use in hiding yourself. We're coming up to get you." But this didn't worry Barney either. By the time they got to the top, he would be well away. The Snargets must have thought this too, because they didn't make a move. They retired inside their rickety shack instead. Barney scored another direct hit on it, and a near miss. Heads popped out each time and looked round fiercely, but he was too well hidden and they failed to spot him. But there seemed to be a lot of whispering going on in the shack, and then all three Snargits came out and started walking towards the way out. The eldest called over his shoulder in a casual voice, "Goodbye, Albert," and the other two repeated it. "We're going home now, Albert," called the eldest. "It's our dinner time. But listen here, Albert, we know you're up there. You just keep your hands off our shack, see? We've got something in there that's valuable. We just dare you to meddle with it, that's all." The Snargits walked off towards the way out of the pit, whistling loudly and banging tins with sticks. Barney waited until he could hear their feet on the lane, dying away. Funny, he thought. They've gone. Still, perhaps it is their dinner time. He came out from behind his tree and went round the edge of the pit to the low side and walked along the bottom to the shack. The shack the Snargits had built. He wondered what the valuable thing was that they had left in it. There didn't seem to be anything except a paper bag full of chestnut conkers. "Phew, silly old conkers," said Barney aloud. "They're not valuable." Perhaps they'd buried something. He dug around in the mossy floor and unearthed a very rusty tin box. It had writing on the outside. He could just make out the letters. "Gold block," it said. It felt heavy. Ought he open it or not? He decided he would. There was no harm in just looking. The hinge lid was rusted to the bottom and wouldn't move. He banged at it with a stone. Out fell a rusty mass of screws, nuts, bolts and curtain rings. Inside the lid of the box was more writing which said that gold block was the finest pipe tobacco, made from choice Virginia leaf. Barney threw the tin away in disgust, and a voice said, "All right, mister, come out. We've got you covered." It was the Snargits. They'd played a trick on him and crept back. He came out of the shack and faced the Snargits. One had a broken old air gun, and the others were pointing sticks. "Caw, it ain't Albert!" exclaimed the youngest Snargit. "We can see that," said the oldest roughly. "What's your name?" he said to Barney in the same voice. "Barney, what's yours?" "I'm the Lone Ranger, and he's Robin Hood, and he's William Tell," snapped the eldest Snargit. "Golly!" exclaimed Barney. "Quiet!" snapped the first Snargit. "What are you doing in our shack?" "Yes, and what you mean by chucking dirt at us?" asked the second Snargit. "Yes, and what you doing in our dump anyway?" piped the youngest fiercely. "Can if I want to," replied Barney, pretending not to mind, but he was not really feeling very comfortable. He was not sure just how rough these Snargits could get. "Can if he wants to, he says," exclaimed the Lone Ranger, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "What shall we do with him, fellas?" "Tie him to a tree and shoot him in fuller ears," suggested Robin Hood. "Put him in a dungeon and leave him to rot," said William Tell. "No, I reckon we ought to lynch him on the spot. String him up," said the Lone Ranger masterfully. "We ain't got no rope," said Robin Hood. "Well, we ain't got no bow and arrows," pointed out William Tell. "Well, there certainly ain't no dungeon for miles around," said the Lone Ranger. "Let's just give him a bit of slow torture." "You wouldn't dare," said Barney, but he didn't feel too sure. "Oh, wouldn't we?" sneered the Lone Ranger. "That's what you think. We often do, don't we, fellas? Do it all the time, don't we? Give the people slow torture." "Yes, and shoot 'em," agreed Robin Hood. "And put 'em in dungeons," added William Tell. "I'd tell a policeman," said Barney stoutly. The eldest Snargit looked carefully round the pit. "Can't see no policeman here," he said scornfully. "I'd tell my granny, and she lives just up there," said Barney. The Snargits collapsed in howls of laughter. "Tell your granny," he says. "Hear that, fellas? He'd tell his granny," they cackled. Barney felt his face going red and tears coming into his eyes. Then he thought of something. "I'm going to tell Stig," he said calmly. The laughter went on. "He's going to tell his Stig," cackled the Snargits. But Barney just stood there and smiled, and the laughter gradually died down. "Who's Stig?" the eldest Snargit asked suspiciously. "Oh, a friend of mine," replied Barney airily. "Huh, there ain't such no person," said the second doubtfully. "Yes, there is, and he's my friend," said Barney. "Where's he live?" squeaked the smallest Snargit. "Here," said Barney. "Here? calls the Snargit scornfully. What, in the dump? Jeered the eldest Snargit, and they all laughed as if he had made a joke. Yes, said Barney. Didn't you know? Go on, you can't half tell him, said the second. What's he do? Tell us then. He makes bows out of television aerials and arrows out of bits of flint, replied Barney. The Snargits gaped at him with open mouths. Look here, said the eldest at last. This here Stig of yours. What is he then? A boy or a man? Barney had to think a little before he answered. Then he said, He's a caveman. At once the Snargits burst into jeers and laughter again. Yay, soppy old caveman. He's got it out of a school book. He's pulling our legs, making out he knows a caveman. Come on, fellas, let's do him. Slow torture, they cried. But Barney leapt off the pile of rubble he was standing on and set off at a run towards the other end of the pit. The Snargits were after him with their shrill cries. And we will see what happens to Barney tomorrow. See you later.